Hi there. Thank you so much for joining. Um, my name's Anna Gross. I'm a political correspondent at the Financial Times, and we're here today to talk about a report that's been launched by the Future Governance Forum, which is called A Mountain to Scale: How the New Government Can Empower Startup Tech Businesses to Grow and Flourish, which is a perennial problem that no one seems to ever have the answers to, but they're presenting a few of them, or a few ideas. So Charlotte Holloway, who's the lead author of the report, is here with us. She has spent the past decade working in digital and economic policy and advocacy, and most recently worked at Zoom Video Communications. And she's also a board member of Tech UK. So I'm going to hand over to Charlotte, and maybe you can take us through some of the key points in the report.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you everyone who's joining us today. I'm delighted to be a policy associate at the Future Governance Forum. If you're new to their work, I suggest checking out their website during the course of this event. This report, A Mountain to Scale, is the fourth in the series from FGF on rebuilding the nation. And I've been absolutely delighted to have the support of BVCA and Boardwave. We'll hear from Karim and Michael on that later, in producing this report, which was pulled together from in-depth research, interviews with the entire ecosystem of players affecting how we get more growing, high success scale-ups, tech scale-ups here in the UK. So thank you to BVCA and to Boardwave for supporting this report. So I'll take a moment just to set the scene. We are now 6 months into the new government, and this month actually marks 2 years on since Lord O'Neill produced the Startup Scale-Up Review for the then Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. And in that report, Rachel Reeves said in her foreword that she wanted to transform the UK into the best place to start and grow a business. We've seen a huge amount from the government about their mission-driven government approach. We've seen a number of significant policy interventions over the last 6 months. And what this report seeks to do is to really show that whilst the government has many of the right instincts around supporting our scaling companies, there is a huge and unique inflection point here around political opportunity, but also the global technology opportunity that we have to get many more of these high growth companies here successful in the UK. Despite a number of successful policy interventions in recent years, the scale-up ecosystem here does face a number of long-standing barriers. We are a powerhouse for innovation. We're the home to trailblazers like DeepMind, fintech leaders like Starling Bank, and we have a tech sector valued at over $1 trillion. Yet the comparisons with the US are quite stark. It takes an average of 17 years in the UK for scale-ups to grow from 10 million to £100 million, compared to just 10 years in the US. And I know this is a big passion point of Phil's, which I'm sure he'll draw on later. This isn't just an issue for the businesses and success themselves. It's an economic imperative. Scale-ups represent just 0.6% of UK's SME base, but contribute over 50% of SME output. They employ over 3 million people in the UK, SMEs, and those generate 1.2 trillion annually. So the real premise here is if we start making ever more targeted interventions to support this very special cohort of high growth scale-ups, then we can really move the dial for many of the things that this government wants to achieve. So we've been very good at being Incubator Britain. We've got a great reputation for entrepreneurial activity. We are excelling in fostering startups and early stage innovation. But we're failing to make that shift and evolve into a true scale-up nation. That transition point from startup to scale-up is still very tricky for many firms. And we do lag behind some of our global competitors when it comes to helping businesses reach their potential. Those persistent barriers to progress include things around there's a 15 billion annual funding gap, for those latter stage companies looking for growth funding, and an over concentration, this will not surprise anyone, on London and the Southeast. Skill shortages we talk about a lot in the report, particularly for founders and managers. A new finding in here is around those transitionary management skills, and also adapting in management roles to how to leverage AI tools as well. So I'll sort of go into the recommendations shortly, but I think it's important to note the context of which the government has made strides in the last 6 months. The industrial strategy, Invest 35, shows some very promising signs around the 8 high growth sectors. The British Growth Partnership, based within the British Bank, is modelled on the Francis Tibby scheme, and I'll go on to say a little bit more about why we think there's real opportunity to go further in here and close that critical valley of death. The government's also had its National Wealth Fund, which does have potential to align more closely with scale-ups, what scale-ups need here. And we have some really promising signs from the government with the introduction of the Regulatory Innovation Office, the devolution deals and local growth plans, the new pension mega funds, which were announced last fund, which aims to unlock over £80 billion worth of funding into infrastructure and high growth businesses, and some of the measures in the autumn budget as well. So the report itself goes into some depth into the challenges that scale-ups face. We structure these broadly into 3 categories: money and markets, place and people. And the solutions that we detail are kind of 15 recommendations based across those 3 pillars, but also adding a critical 4th on governance as well. When it comes to solving some of the sticking challenges around access to capital and access to markets, we make a number of recommendations. Firstly, we make a number of recommendations on how to leverage the pension mega funds to support scale-ups nationwide. We want to see more done on really having the ambition for the new British Growth Partnership. We suggest a number of ideas about how that can be one of the most ambitious schemes in the world, borrowing on some of the great points of what's happened in France, but also really having a focus on later stage investment too. We make recommendations around a stronger, transparent growth database for investors to see what scale-up potential there is in the UK. We make some suggestions around reforming the enterprise investment scheme, having a scale-up investment scheme component, and extending the current enterprise management scheme, welcomed by founders and many in the ecosystem that I've spoken to, successful, but having an extension that again suggests a number of more targeted interventions that benefit that critical cohort of companies. It wouldn't be a report around helping scale-ups and companies if we didn't talk more about the role of government procurement, and we talk about setting some initial ambitions for the government in having 5% of government contracts aimed at going to tech scale-ups. We also talk about some suggestions for enhancing the role of the British Business Bank and the National Wealth Fund to better support patient capital. Moving on to place, we thought there's huge potential here for the government to look at aligning its ambitions on devolution and the local growth plans, obviously very topical at the moment, to include a scale-up duty as part of those local growth plans, so that each local authority or combined authority area has a real duty to see how they're supporting local firms. We also have recommendations on improving spin-out practices in research universities, and incentivizing better ways in which spin-outs from universities don't have too much of their equity held up with universities to incentivize more private investors. When it comes to the chronic skills and people challenges that our scale-ups are facing, we make a number of recommendations around launching a national leadership network, building on some successes that are already out there. And I know Phil is probably the preeminent expert in this and will have more to add. We talk about expanding AI and digital skills programs under the Growth and Skills Levy. And we also recommend scaling the flexible AI upskilling fund to tackle a number of the workforce gaps. And then finally, on governance, we talk about adding some scale-up metrics into some of the new evaluation frameworks under the Labour's 5 missions. We think that embedding scale-ups in those missions will be absolutely critical, not only for achieving them, but for unlocking that next wave of growth. We talk a lot about in the report, and I can talk about this more in the Q&A, just so many founders, so many high potential scale-ups in the UK who are clamoring to play a role in each of the government's 5 missions, and I'm sure also the new milestones as well. We also want to make sure that in the way that government goes about assessing its performance, that scale-up voices are really embedded, such as in the newly reformed Industrial Strategy Council, and that is our final recommendation. So that's a quick trot through, Anna, but I think the report itself is really a call to action. We're 2 years on from the O'Neill review. Labour's got its feet under the table. The new government is up and running. It's set its clear direction. It's shown that it's got a lot of the right instincts. Now it's time to really scale its own ambition to unlock the huge potential that we have in the UK, not just for those businesses, but for our future as a country as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Charlotte. We'll come back and interrogate some of those ideas shortly. Just so anyone who's watching knows, you can input questions in the chat box, should be easy to find. And then at the end, we should have a good sort of 15-20 minutes to go through some of those questions, which we can put to the various panelists. Before we go to questioning some of those ideas that you put forward and seeing how they might work in practice, I want to introduce our other panelists. So we've got Kanishka Narayan, who's a new Labour MP for the Vale of Glamorgan, elected in July 2024, but who previously had a senior role in government, as well as private sector roles, and was a senior advisor at the Cabinet Office and an expert advisor to Britain's Environment Secretary. So, Kanishka, do you want to start by just talking us through, just introducing some of your thoughts on this?
Sounds great, Anna. Thanks very much, and thanks everyone who's joined as well. Anna, being introduced as a new Labour MP leaves a degree of ambiguity about the novelty or the political positioning that I have. So just to be clear, I'm a new Labour MP in the term of being elected 5 months ago. As Anna said, served in government as a civil servant, and then in finance, running the European part of a US venture firm. Really excited to be part of this conversation, and I think Charlotte, you've done a huge service to all of us in focusing the public conversation on scale-ups for 2 reasons. One, because I think clearly to the overall growth and productivity focus that the government has, looking at scale-ups is critical. It's critical because we know, not least from the work you've done, that scale-ups are way more innovative than large firms, twice as innovative in many cases in terms of the level of R&D intensity and patenting, but also materially more productive. And so if we're trying to move the needle on productivity and long-run growth in this country, looking at the firms and the people who have been able to do that is a really great way of doing it. I think the second reason is, I think a lot of the focus we've had in the broad technology focus for this government has been to align where things were on frontier innovation with the question of how we make sure that the whole country can benefit from technological adoption. And to the question of adoption, what scale-ups are able to do, I think is critical. Government has tried historically to push the supply of specific products and services digitally to particular firms. That has often been very, very tough. To me, a better route and an interesting route is to look at what scale-ups that already drive adoption by being able to design products in a way that meet people where they are and businesses where they are. I think it's an important driver as well. So both in driving growth and productivity as firms, but also in driving technological adoption, therefore driving growth across the wider economy, is a really critical focus. I think a number of your policy themes are spot on, and so I won't dive hugely into it, but let me make one macro comment and then 4 specifics. One macro comment, which is a lot of the conversation, I think, especially when it comes to financing of scale-ups, ends up focusing on inflows, how much money is going into the system. To me, a fundamental challenge in Britain is outflows, which is if you're able to solve the sense that actually you can generate great returns and a great sense of outcome for scale-ups, I think inflows actually are much more contingent. And so if you look at the largest funds of funds in Europe, they often invest something like just under 50%, 48% or so of their money into British venture. into US venture, get 51%, 52% of their returns, i.e. the returns exceed the amount they put in, and it's a big share. When it comes to the UK, those funds, many of them based in the UK, invest something like 5% in the UK and get 3% in terms of returns. And so for us, of course, we should focus on inflows consistently. And there's a great argument. We're trying to do a lot on pensions in particular. But the big exam question for me when it comes to scale ups, which is fundamentally tackled by your skills and procurement and regional disparities focus as well, is how can we create an environment where our scale ups thrive and succeed? And there are 4 things that are on my mind, which are very consistent with the work that Charlotte and the team have done. The first of those, I think, is fundamentally about the stat you had in there, which is that it takes 17 years for a UK scale up to go from 10 to 100 million, compared to 8 to 10 in the United States. And I think one driver of that, in my anecdotal experience, is the quality of senior management, not just in terms of driving and creating products, but fundamentally as buyers. It takes a much longer time to sell high quality technology and AI products into British companies, enterprises in particular, than it does in the United States. And a big focus on the skill side that I see is for us to be able to drive management quality, to be able to adopt tech in a quicker way at the large cap end in particular. A second thing that I think is really interesting when it comes to scale ups is market size. People often say one of the reasons it's very hard to get to 100 million in the UK is we're way smaller than the United States. But I think what that requires as a result is a far greater export orientation. And so I'd be interested in specific ideas and how we can, from day one, become much more export oriented, because clearly in the anecdotal case of Israel, market size has not been a constraint on scale ups. A third thing, which I think is interesting, again, in the access to finance world that Charlotte talked about, is the link between the recommendations on greater funding and the outflows conversation specifically. So at the moment, a lot of talk is focused on public markets. I'm very interested in how we create more pathways for people to be able to generate returns and recycle money into the ecosystem through secondary, late-stage private markets as well, because not everyone needs to go and have a blowout multi-billion, 10 billion pound private public market outcome. Actually, we can do a huge amount more by having a richer variation in that part of the market. And then the final thing, which is a really exciting thing that the report, I think, contributes to, which is the moment we start taking seriously the scale-ups are going to be a very material driver of our national productivity story. We can actually identify them and then do everything that they tell us they need to turbocharge them. I think that sort of hands-on, strategic, active state vision that I think we have in this government, based on the missions that we have, is one that says, let's go and attack the challenge head on, which is, if scale-ups are the answer, let's find high-quality data through digital. I speak to financial services providers, the fintech providers that work with scale-ups, for example. You can look in real time at who's selling quickest and how firms are growing. You can look at the attributes of those firms and genuinely go and meet them and try and do everything you can to support them. So that sort of hands-on, identify and just do everything to make them a success story is part of it as well. But look, let me just close by saying a big thank you again. I think this is a really fundamental contribution to the overall productivity and growth conversation that we're having in this country. The recommendations are, I think, very thought-provoking on the right lines, and I'm excited that this will hopefully move the conversation on.
Thanks a lot, Kanishka. Interesting idea that also came up in the report there about actually just trying to incentivize identifying which the companies are, whether that's at a local level or at a national level, finding out where they are, finding out what they need, and an interesting point as well about export orientation.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
That is clearly an avenue for growth.
It's kind of clean, it's not just scrolling massive.
So I'm just going to introduce our other panelists. Sorry if there's a bit of background noise, but I'm in the House of Parliament and busy office. So Phil Robinson, who is the CEO of Boardwave, which is a platform connecting software leaders across Europe to foster collaboration and accelerate success. But he's had executive roles across loads of different private sector companies: Exact, Iris Software, Cybal Systems, if I'm saying that correctly, and Salesforce, where he served as chief marketing officer. So Phil, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Anna. I appreciate that introduction. Yeah, I'm a software guy for the last 37 years. I've worked for American firms and helped them build their business in Europe, and I've also been a CEO multiple times for startups and scale-ups in the UK and in other countries in Europe. And I quit that career really to try and help the UK tech industry and the European tech industry to scale. So we created Boardwave 2.5 years ago as a social enterprise. It's trying to create the same conditions for success for scale-ups in the UK and Europe as existed for a generation in California and in Silicon Valley. And we've created a community of what I think are the best and brightest leaders from across the UK and European software industries. So going back to Kanishka's question about identifying who these companies are, we've gone from thinking this would be a small initiative in the UK to something that's pan-European, which is about the size of the market, which is really important. We have 1,900 members already in 2.5 years. Each of them are some of the best and brightest founders and leaders in technology and software in the UK, which there are 1,100, and the other 800 are across the rest of Europe. So these people are coming together to share their network, their knowledge, their expertise, their capabilities with one another, so that we can share that joint knowledge and sort of knowledge base the way that Californians will. So that in California, we know they're very, very successful, but basically due to proximity, you've got a very deep and dense talent pool, which all work in the same industry, speaking the same language, and very prepared to help and support each other and share their success with one another to build the next great technology business on a global basis. So an example would be something like PayPal. The founders of PayPal in 1998, 14 of them, 2 of them went to LinkedIn, 2 went to build YouTube, a few of them went to Tesla. It's recycling of both knowledge and expertise and capital from one to the other. So you have one great company that's really successful, which generates the next and the next and the next. You get sort of this founder factory mentality. We've not really scaled very many, if any, great technology businesses here for very many years. So we don't have those founder factories from which to spawn the next generation of leaders and the skills that we need to build those ongoing and the momentum in the industry of scale businesses. In fact, we're sort of really good in the UK at supporting startups. We've done a great job building a startup ecosystem. Our view is that about £10 million of turnover, they turn into a scale up. And that £10 to £100 million journey to the scaling the business is where we reach a glass ceiling in the UK, because all the great support we have for startups in the first years of their innovation and their development, all that support sort of falls away as they begin to scale up. And that's the very time at which those people need the help and support of both the community and the investors. And so that's one of the gaps we're trying to solve with Boardwave, actually helping to build a community work together the way the Californians would. So you sort of got this approach in the UK where we're really good at starting businesses but not scaling them. And I would say that there's a couple of reasons for that. Kanishka's already referenced this from the report. So it takes 17 years to grow a company to 100 million in the UK, 8 to 10 in the US. And so because we're slower at growing, we are less able to attract global capital the way that the US would. In fact, if I was an investor, I would invest in a company that's proven through its startup phase and really want to ramp it up and scale it up rapidly as quickly as I can. And I'm going to invest in something that's somewhere else, not in the UK. As a consequence of that, we don't attract the right talent or retain the right talent within those companies, and therefore they take longer. So there's all this vicious circle that we keep going around that we need to break by giving ourselves access to the right capital, the right pool. I agree with Kanishka. The sort of size of the market is really important. We need to be export oriented. We need to behave like the Israelis would do. So they think about global markets, not local markets, and solve global problems from within the Israeli market to build global leaders. We need much more export orientation around building technology that can support the whole of Europe as an ecosystem or as a market to go to, which is the size of the market. I think that's a response to what Kanishka was talking about, some market size. I think the other thing we need to do is get better investment into the UK through being able to prove that we can grow as fast as the Americans or faster. If we can do that, we'll be in a virtuous circle, which will break the glass ceiling and move us forwards. There's loads more in the report, which we talk about this. I think there's really interesting themes in the report that Charlotte's written. I think for us, it's really important that we build community, whether that's local or national community or international community, of the best leaders to share their knowledge with themselves and also with government, so that they know exactly who those companies are and the help they're going to need to continue to scale their businesses. I'll hand back to you, Anna.
Thanks a lot, Phil. Yeah, I guess that is the crux of it, is how you get that financing at the stages where companies are coming are go from being a startup to building scale. And there are some interesting ideas behind that, or recommendations in the report that we might come on to. Final panelist, Karim Palat, who's Director of External Affairs at the BVCA. And he's been working for 2 decades on tech and economic policy. And yeah, I'll hand over to you to explain a little bit what you're thinking on this.
Fantastic. Thanks, Anna, and thanks to Charlotte for the report, and to Future Governance Forum and others for all their work, and and Phil for their thoughts too. I mean, this topic is incredibly broad, and we could dive in at all different angles to try and tackle it. By our approach to this, and we're the trade body for at BVCA, we're the trade body for private equity and venture capital. So venture capital in the UK invests, depending on your measure, billions of pounds into the startup and scale up ecosystem in the UK. We're the largest hub for private capital outside of the US worldwide. We represent, several hundred investor firms, split roughly 50-50 between venture capital and private equity in the UK. And by our measure, about 8 billion of kind of pure equity is invested in venture capital, was invested in venture capital last year in the UK. That capital, and I think it's really important to note here that capital comes from all around the world. That is capital that is coming from investors that are, sovereign wealth funds or pensions from around the world. It's endowment, university endowments from US universities. It's rich individuals. It's capital that comes from, pension funds in Australia, Canada, the US. And that is brought to the UK because we have the expertise here in a flourishing venture capital and private equity community that can go and invest in businesses that are where they see an opportunity, and they will invest across Europe. But of the capital invested here by funds led from the UK, around half of it goes to UK businesses on average. And what does that mean? It means, first of all, we're getting capital from around the world. It means, second of all, we've got investment expertise. And Kanishka, that was your industry prior to going into Parliament. There's a whole industry here of people who know how to invest in and scale up businesses. And as Phil outlined, we're really great at that early stage startup phase, and we're really great at the sort of larger scale phase. The bit that's missing is that scale up, and that's what's so important about this report. And the bit is that taking a business from a really great start, innovative, top-end IP coming out of a university, and we have world-leading universities in the UK, driving the kind of creativity and the deep tech and the really sort of special idea that's going to foster a business, and then turning that into something that is a globally commercializable product, or certainly an internationally commercializable product, that can be a business of the size and scale that will really drive a material impact across the economy. And that is essentially the pinch point we're trying to tackle here. And the report has 15 different ways in which to deal with that. I'm not going to run through all 15. Charlotte's already done a lot of that, and the report itself really merits a read. But I think there are a couple of key things that I would draw attention to. We've talked about pensions, and actually the government, one of the very first things that the Chancellor Rachel Reeves did when she came in, and the appointment of Emma Reynolds, who's the pensions minister across Treasury and DWP, was a very clear signal of intent on this, is that they've prioritised this issue of pensions reform in the UK. I mentioned that international capital that goes into our startups and scale-ups in the UK. It's just worth pausing on this. We have more pensions capital going into startups and scale-ups in the UK, or certainly venture and growth funds in the UK, than any other European country. But 97% of that capital comes from around the world. And 16 times more comes from around the world than goes into UK funds. Last year, incredibly, we had more pensions money from Swedish pension funds going into UK fast-growing businesses than we did from UK pension funds. So this isn't like we're being swamped by some big US pension funds. We're just not as good at it, even as, say, Sweden, which is a much smaller country, in terms of investing in our own startups and on our own investment funds. So why is that happening? Well, there's a huge amount of work being done by ourselves and others in the pensions industry over the last year or two to try and understand that barrier. But the government has taken a lead on this and has brought forward the pensions review, which is going forwards, and talked about these mega funds, the pensions mega funds that have been talked about, and that's the need to be really ambitious is highlighted in this reform in this report, and it's something that we're all, I think, on this call agree that needs to be incredibly ambitious. But a couple of key things in that: one is it's got to be that when we create scale, we don't lose the ability to invest in smaller regional and specific UK-facing funds that are more that have that kind of particular expertise in investing locally, because there is a local bias to where people invest, because this is a kind of hands-on engaged investing in firms. That means that you want to be near where you're investing, and you want to understand the local market. You want to understand the skills of the founders that you're investing in, and the ecosystem they're working in. So that's really, really important. So we need to make sure that the governance of these mega funds, especially the local government ones, that they have the governance and the expertise to continue to be able to invest regionally. Second of all, there is a regional element pulled out in the report. So once we've gone big on the pensions piece, we need to start thinking about how to ensure that, ultimately, where are we strong in the UK? We're strong in the UK in London. We're strong in the UK in what's called the Golden Triangle around Oxford, Cambridge, and that's because there is a world-leading intellectual property and research and high-tech innovation that's going on, but there is also a record of getting those ideas investor ready. So building out the ecosystem, whether it be Cambridge Enterprise or Oxford Enterprise, that is allowing those ideas to be turned into investor ready businesses that have had early stage capital from things like the British Business Bank and elsewhere via cornerstoning specific funds. And we need to get that happening all over the country. And that needs to be things like Northern Gritstone, but we've not managed to get things like the Midlands Engine kind of firing as much as it could be. The South, there's similar innovations in the Southwest, and let's try and get more of that going. And that's a big part of this. And I mentioned the British Business Bank, and I'll finish on that, which is to say that the British Business Bank is fantastic as an innovation. It has helped, like Phil talked about, that startup ecosystem. It has helped cornerstone some fantastic funds at that early stage. And we've got some great venture investors in the UK that over the last 10 years or so have been fostered and brought into existence by the support of the British Business Bank. But the British Business Bank is capped. It's both capped in terms of how much capital it has, and it's capped in terms of how far up the life cycle of businesses it can cornerstone funds and support funds. And if you compare the amount of capital and how later stage of a fund the British Business Bank can cornerstone and support, compared with, say, the European Investment Fund, actually what we've lost by moving out of the European Investment Fund, we have not replaced with what the British Business Bank can do, and that's a really important part of this conversation. And that if there are ways in which that can impact, and one of those would be things like, they say, the Tibi scheme, which took place in France, which is a way of using the expertise of say the British Business Bank, which we would do in the UK, but levering in that capital from UK leading investors. That was done not just by creating the institution and the infrastructure, but by political leadership. Literally Emmanuel Macron on the phone to investors saying, get on board. And that's the kind of scale and ambition that we should be doing if we're going to be getting the BBB and whatever to start fixing those things. So I'll finish there. But I would also say that I completely agree on the size of the addressable market, which is both a kind of public services procurement piece and an international export piece. And our trading relationship with our biggest trading partners is obviously a big part of that.
Thanks, Karen. I just want to pick up on the point that you made about us being so reliant on international investment into UK companies. What's your sense of, because that seems to be the crux of it, that there has been historically, and I know Labour's trying to address it, a reluctance to invest in some of in small startup British companies by British investors. And what would you say is behind that? Is there a sort of, is it a risk aversion? Is there data that on the extent to which those companies actually succeed in the end that puts institutional investors off?
So I would say, in terms of the returns of investing in private capital, the returns are there. So you can demonstrate that this is a way to get stronger returns for pension savers. That's that's pretty clear. I point you to our research hub on our website, and that will set out the details of that. But they're substantially higher than investing across the sort of the public markets. But there are challenges in investing in this type of capital. One, it is illiquid, so you're committing for a long time. You can't get your money out whenever you need. Two, it is varied in terms of the risks are varied across different funds, and so there are going to be some funds where there's a downside, but the average is that ultimately it's better. So you need to diversify, because that's the way in which you get the average returns, by diversifying across a range of funds. But the net effect of that is that you need to have a certain size and a certain scale. And in the UK, we have a situation where a lot of our pension funds, the shift into defined contribution schemes over a number of years meant that we had a large number of smaller funds that didn't have the scale. And we created the situation where they were competing purely on price. So we created a regulatory environment for a long time, which thankfully is no longer there in a regulatory sense, but it's created a culture where effectively you're choosing your pension fund based on the kind of the fee that you're charged annually, and not looking at the returns year on year and what you'll end up with as your pension pot at the end, which is clearly the most important thing. But we created a regulatory environment where people were looking at the fees year on year. And actually what that meant was people were avoiding costs, which expert investment requires, but losing out on returns as a result. So that lack of scale and lack of expertise and the avoidance of cost were both really, really important. And thankfully, both the previous government and this current government are really, really addressing this.
Got it. Yeah, I guess another thing that's always of interest to me on this question, there have been a few comparisons to the US. Maybe that is the best kind of comparator country, but are there other models that you would point to, or other policy frameworks that have worked really well in other countries that you would say that this is something that the UK should borrow from? Karim, you did mention France, but I don't know if anyone else has kind of experience looking at other policies elsewhere that the UK could borrow from.
If I could cover the first, Anna. Yeah, it's a really important question. I mean, UK has a unique set of circumstances, as many different countries around the world. We do have an annex of the report which looks at a number of different countries in depth. Israel has been mentioned a number of times on this event so far today. Some of what they've done, particularly around targeted R&D funding, I think there are lessons that we can learn from. Similarly, Singapore, the way they do government-led innovation and really leverage the power of in-government innovation, and this sort of, I guess, has quite a lot of chiming with comments from Pat McFadden this week. Around how do you pick particular sectors through government innovation to really scale in. So I think we'd look to the Singapore example. South Korea, one of the largest levels of R&D investment globally. Many success stories that can be pointed to there. And I think that split between private and public R&D investment is what makes the South Korean case quite interesting as well. So as I say, in the annex of this report, there are some examples that we touch upon throughout the report. And then finally, France and the success of the TIBI scheme, which we talk about quite a lot in the report. As Karim said, it's getting that. Yes, it's about the sort of structure of these programs and so forth, but the high level political leadership, which I think in a UK context would flow very nicely after some of the interventions at the investment summit we had on the 14th of October, for example. So just really maintaining that level of international signalling about how serious we are to to get those high potential firms here, but also that they stay here, so that if you are a UK founder or a CEO, you don't think, I'm going to reach this point and then I've got to weigh up whether I stay here or go abroad or whatever it is. I know Phil's network has as many founders who I was delighted to speak to throughout the course of this report who talk through some of those examples and actually borrowing and tailoring some of what's in the Tibi scheme for the UK could just send a really, really positive sign about the UK's scale of ambition.
And just one more question before I hand over to the audience who sent over some interesting questions. I know that this report touches upon it, that the role of public procurement in helping companies scale up. I'm interested, Kanishka, in whether you think there is a kind of really material role that the government can play there, whether that would actually move the dial, and also what might have hindered that the government from procuring from smaller British companies to date. Is that, again, is it an aversion to risk? Are there not the right incentives in place? Is it kind of just being stuck in some of these bigger contractual arrangements that it's quite hard to get out of? So yeah, Kanishka or Phil, if either of you want to come in there.
When I kick off, and I'm sure Phil's got lots of great ideas from his experience. So, Anna, I mean, you've probably answered the question with all the explanations you've offered. But there is something interesting, which is the combination of risk and kind of capacity broadly, as I sort of described it, and the relationship between the two. So if you're currently procuring, or over the course of the last decade, if you've been procuring a particular service or product, our history of procurement has been based on a contractual model where you get a system integrator, which is normally a very large provider, a sort of usual, I don't want to name any specific companies, but the largest sort of digital services and transformation companies, and then they subcontract to a bunch of other people. And what you end up doing over a period of time in that context is you undermine the fundamental capability that procurement teams have to assess the specific products themselves, because what you're really procuring is the system integrated, the kind of core company that ends up doing a lot of that work. And so I think that's the starting point. When you do that, the risk then in jumping to a different world where you're not procuring a large radical sort of integrator firm, which is de-risking everything else, but instead you're assessing a specific product, a specific company, which is a startup or a scale up. That is a very, very different capability and capacity question. And in the absence of it, the risk associated with that is way higher. So yes, it is risk, but to me, the underlying thing that drives that perception of risk and the reality of it in some cases is what has happened over time to both capability and capacity in the civil service on the one hand, but also how much technology has moved on, where what might seem like a risky Series A startup at the time you have the first conversation actually becomes a very different proposition within a 12 to 18-month period, where they've been able to go and prove out product market fit, have been able to get to some degree of validation in other contexts. So that's the explanation. I think to the question of can this move the needle? Look, clearly it can. If you think about the entire scale of the public sector in particular, all we're really talking about is a huge sum of investment. Net public investment is tens of billions every single year, and digital and technology is an important but also growing part of it. So I think it can move the needle. The fundamental thing I think we need is to do what we've been starting to do through the Digital Centre of Government work that is going on at DCIT in particular, which is how can we build capability and then come up with common standards, common frameworks, so that we reduce the cost of firms engaging with government and ultimately move to a case where we're assessing quality of product and service, not perceived risk in terms of scale.
Could I just add to that, Anna, in terms of Kanishka's point? I couldn't agree more on much of what Kanishka's just said. I think that we've had a whole generation of procurement where it's been SI-led. Those SI organizations have not really preferred local companies, have preferred technology from elsewhere. And so we have a whole generation of successful procurement by government of international technology products where actually we need to prefer our own. And perhaps we go a framework where the SI is somewhat forced into preferring to supply government with our own technology and our own products versus somebody else's. They are often very isolated from the technology itself. there are organisations that have won huge multi-billion-dollar contracts with government over the last few years. I mean, Palantir would be one example of many who've procured a massive contract with government. They only started in 2001 or two after 9/11. And so that's a very large organisation with lots of success, but it hasn't been around very long, really, in the big scheme of things. There's other organisations just like that. If we could scale them in the UK, could have the same sort of success that they've had, and would therefore be able to, have the capability and the credibility to own one of those contracts the way they have. It's just one example of many, but we really do need to support our own technology innovation in the UK versus buying from somewhere else.
Could I add on Phil's point there, Anna? I think the points by both Kanish and Phil are really well made, and what came through in many of the interviews and discussions we had in pulling this report together is there are some scale-up founders who they just won't go there. They just do not have the confidence that it is worth the time to spend innovating and thinking about how they can solve that problem. Now, I do think hopefully we're at a bit of a tipping point where that culture and that attitude can change. I mentioned the Pat McFadden speech this week about bringing in more innovators. Obviously, there's a sort of global lens through what's going on in the US at the moment, which I'm not going to go there quite on this call today. But we have to really think about how do we build confidence back in our startup and scale up founders that it is worth taking the time and investment to go for those big contracts. When I've worked in environments before when you're up against larger firms, and it takes a lot of time to get that stamp, get that approval, get that standard. And if you're a founder and you're making decisions that chasing a bit of business from the private sector is going to get you more returns, less of a headache, and better for you, we've got to really think about how we build that confidence back up that innovating with government to achieve desired public outcomes is really worth that time and effort. But I think we've still got a lot of encouraging signs there, and there are good programs and schemes, so I'm not throwing everything out. There are bits of really good work out there that were raised, but I think there's a broader confidence about innovating in government that we need to help our scale up to see and realise once again.
And the sense I get is that ministers and policymakers are aware of some of these issues. They hear a lot from the companies that they can be quite labyrinthine and incredibly challenging to sell to government. Even when it comes to something like the NHS, you might be selling to one trust, and it could be sold to dozens of them, if not the whole NHS, but it's just also split up, and there doesn't seem to be much kind of central thinking around how to make the process better. Got a question from an audience member, Nick Axford, who's asking, and this is quite relevant to the report, some of the stuff around devolution. What can councils do to support and encourage small businesses to scale up? And how important is an improvement to transport infrastructure, particularly in the north, to scaling up in those regions? I don't know if anyone in particular wants to think about that. Karim, go ahead.
I think it's worth saying. So councils is a broad term, and there are combined authorities that have a sense of scale and will represent an area that's got a big, a reasonably large kind of economy or travel to work area and so on. And then there are smaller areas, and I think ultimately, scaling up and venture is an investment in a company that has a very high ceiling, but was also quite risky. And therefore, it's gonna cluster around areas of where there are ecosystems, where there is intellectual property and innovation and so on. So it will naturally cluster around, say, universities and university cities and towns. So that's kind of it's not going to work for everywhere that there's going to be a sort of that kind of ecosystem growing up. Where you have that potential, what you need is investors to be able to. You need to bring together the ideas and the investors and the firms and the investors, and it can be as prosaic as transport. So it can be as simple as if you can get on the train from where your VC firm is based more easily to this place, you're more willing to take the investment and sit on the board of that company, because a lot of the time you'll invest in that firm and you'll participate directly in the running of the firm. So that makes it does make a big difference. The other thing is access to skills. So access to, if you're trying to scale a business, especially one which is at sort of cutting edge and doing kind of high end stuff, you need skills. You need people with particular skills and information, sort of experience. And the size of your addressable labor market matters a lot. So can you? I've had people say to me, well, I've invested in this kind of thing in Manchester, but I wouldn't do it in Liverpool because there isn't the ecosystem there. And to be frank, the distance between Manchester and Liverpool is not massively different from the distance from one end of Silicon Valley to the other. So that's absurd, but actually that's the way in which a lot of the time we think about it. So there is there's a knowledge, and councils can play a role in that, in convening people, in bringing people together. And we find as BBCA, we try and work with regional authorities and whatever to bring investors and local businesses and the ecosystem, the universities and so on together. And we find huge variation across the country between those areas where there is the sort of ability and kind of the resource, frankly, to engage with us, and places where we spend a lot of time kind of trailing around trying to find the right person at the combined authority who can actually help us set the thing up and bring people together. And we try and do a fair bit of that ourselves.
Go ahead, Kanishka.
Very, very quickly, I totally agree with Prem. And let me just give you an anecdotal story that puts this into reality. So Admiral Insurance is Wales's largest publicly listed company. It was founded, the founders live in my constituency and in Cardiff as well. And the story of Admiral is that when they were setting it up, as told to me by one of the founders, when they were setting it up, they were figuring out where to go. Brand new company that just left their jobs to go and set this thing up. A economic redevelopment officer from Cardiff Council got on the train from Cardiff to Paddington, went to see these guys who just run the company and said, come to Cardiff. We're going to support you in every way we can. I'm going to come to all your parties and I'm going to make this work for you. It's only 2 hours or so on the train as well. Transport worked decently. They went to Cardiff. They thought living in the Vale of Glamorgan was a nice proposition at a personal level. And the story of Admiral Insurance would not have happened if it weren't for the total agency of that council officer in Cardiff City Council. So I think there's a real opportunity for every council to try and adopt this sense of we can go and make things happen with a little bit of support that we're trying to provide in terms of powers, in terms of money, but more than anything else, in terms of a sense of stability as partners at central government as well.
And there's, oh, sorry, go ahead, Charlotte.
No, thanks, Anna. Kanishka, I love that example so much. And I think there must be other economic development officers in other councils kicking themselves they didn't get to that meeting first. But well done, Vale of Glamorgan. The report does make a number of recommendations around the role of councils, so encourage Nick to take a look at that. But I think we are missing, or there is potential rather, in this debate between what all this exciting stuff we've got around devolution at the moment, the local growth plans, the shape of form and scope of the combined authorities. This is all very, very live for those that follow this closely, and colleagues at FGF follow this incredibly closely. What we do in this report is propose a scale-up duty, actually, whether you're in a council that's in a combined authority or not, but looking at how do these local growth plans actually, help create the conditions for that economic development officer that Kanishka has just referenced to have that hustle, to go out there, to think of themselves as an ambassador for the area. How do you align the sectoral strengths of an area with the industrial strategy, with the growth potential of companies, and really start stitching these things together? I mean, I'm a big fan of local government, and I think those kind of roles that Kanishka mentioned have huge potential here. But if we could embed them in local growth plans, that scale-up duty, that's going to go a long way. So I realise you've not got many minutes to go, Anna.
No, it's fine. I just maybe time for one more question, which is from Tom Edwards. He said that Boardwave, and maybe this one's for you, Phil. Boardwave research has identified a cohort of UK firms already scaling fast enough to meet the 100 million in 10 years or less target. what would you say differentiates those firms from others?
Yes, it's a great point. So we did some research in October to figure out how long it takes UK and European software companies to scale up, which is the 17-year reference. However, of the 300 organizations that were surveyed, 25% of them exhibit the growth characteristics that you would need if you were going to continue on a trajectory towards 100 million in the US. So they're exhibiting the right growth characteristics. And I think our role collectively is to help make sure they remain on that same trajectory to the place where they get to 100 million. Because actually what often happens is it slows down, it becomes more difficult a little bit as they get a bit bigger. And going back to Kanishka's point, we need to know who those companies are specifically, so we give really targeted help and support on that journey to 100 and then on beyond to be global leaders. So I think that's a really important point. We don't know who they are. We know exactly who they are. 25% of the respondents are saying, actually, given my growth rate last year, this year, and expected next year, then we think that we are on the right track. And I can give you the names later, but there's a really good cohort there which you'd be looking at saying, actually, first of all, we need to de-risk their journey so they get there quicker, and therefore they get the right capital invested in the business, retain the right skills. And then we need to make sure that the 25% becomes 30%, becomes 35%. The more companies exhibit the characteristics they have. And that's sort of the beauty of the community and working together to make sure we support each other. And we love Kanishka to be part of that, and anybody else that's on this call that's interested, come and join us on this mission to try and build these global tech giants in the UK.
Well, I wanted to give everyone the chance to have some final reflections, but we're sort of running out. Does anyone have anything burning they'd like to say after hearing what the other panelists said?
Just go big or go home on the pensions reforms.
I think they seem to be going medium at the moment.
Well, there's space for it to go big. We'll see.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you all so much. Just want to remind everyone here that you should read the full report, because it's got tons of really interesting recommendations and data and international comparisons. You can find it on the Future Governance Forum website. And yeah, keep an eye out for other FGF work, because they're doing this whole series on rebuilding the nation, which will have similar reports on lots of other interesting topics. Thank you so much to all the panelists. That was a really, really fascinating discussion. Thanks for your contributions.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anna.